There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Calfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Very excited to have this gentleman here with us. He is a wildlife and conservation photographer, a writer, and a nature guide in 4 different states: Wyoming, Alaska, Colorado, and Montana. Currently, he's in his home in Denver, Colorado. Arthur Lefo. Arthur, thanks for being open to coming on the podcast. You've been traveling. You're back in Denver. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me on. It's been a long time listening to your guys' podcast. Really stoked to have been invited and excited to chat more about wolves and everything else, conservation and photography with you guys for the next hour or so.
Before we get started, tell us just kind of where you've been lately and what adventures you're on. And, by your email exchanges, it seems pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I've been kind of all over the place, like you point out. So I'm in Denver right now. This is kind of just like a 3-day layover, but before going back to Alaska. So I started my year, I guess we'll just talk about 2022. Started my year in Wyoming, leading wolf trips, wolf photography trips, and just wildlife photography trips in general, down in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. And then was back in Colorado for a couple months, just doing some back end work after that. And then I drove up to Alaska with some friends at the end of April to spend my summer season up there. So I'm as you mentioned earlier, I'm a guide and a photographer. And in the summers, I guide up in Juneau, Alaska, and Southeast Alaska, focusing on expanding bear viewing in Southeast Alaska specifically. It's a region I love very dearly. It's a region that I'm looking to do more work in the future, including surrounding wolves. So just been there for a couple weeks, and I just got back from a 2-week trip back to Europe. I'm originally French, grew up in Miami, but I was born in France. So I went back to see some family and spend some time there midsummer while the bears were kind of heading up high into the Alpine during the hot June and July months, which it was oddly really, really hot in Juneau the last month. I think it just started raining again, but they had some days hitting 90 degrees basically in Juneau, which is unheard of. So yeah, kind of bouncing around a lot these days.
I mean, that's got to keep you on your toes. And does that make you more on the nose or on the ball if you're doing anything, that you're constantly moving around, you constantly have a couple of things in the fire, or you seem like you're a guy that needs to keep moving?
Yeah, I definitely am a guy that likes to keep moving. I think it's something I realized. I moved out to Jackson a few years back and lived there for 2 years. And by the end of it, as much as I loved it, I really felt like I was just kind of staying in the same place, being a little stagnant. I was guiding, but, was in Jackson the great majority of the time, even for the guiding. So I realized that I kind of just needed a bit more of a diverse lifestyle. And that's what I pursued. And that's what I got. That's exactly what I'm doing. It's exciting. It's a lot of travel and it's exhausting sometimes, but it's really rewarding. And it's really awesome to be able to see so many different sides of the world and also reconnect, from being in the depths of the wilderness to even reconnecting with sort of places where I'm surrounded by people that we need on our side in the fight for conservation, right? Like, it's easy, I think, as a conservationist, someone who lives in the wilderness, who loves the wilderness so much, to just let yourself be completely immersed in a place like that and sort of lose touch with like the day-to-day lives of folks in the real world, so to say. And so I really appreciate, having that change in perspective and bringing myself back to like what people are actually doing in their day-to-day lives and incorporating that into my conservation work and how I go about my job.
Being one of these folks who's, seemingly been everywhere, what's an adventure or location that's on your long-term bucket list, like a dream location, a dream adventure that just has not come to pass just yet?
Yeah. So I think about adventures very much in the scope of wildlife. So some bucket list items. I have photographed polar bears before, but I really want to check out Svalbard. That's definitely a goal. I'd like to get up there as the sea ice starts to melt, to get some photos of polar bears on ice. Also would love to go back to Patagonia, photograph some pumas, and also Brazil for jaguars. All those are really incredible places. Pumas and jaguars are two species I have not photographed, but I'd really like to get back there, as well as Asia. I guess I'll just throw that in there too. I'd love to go chase some snow leopards. As much luck as it might be required to see one, it's definitely an adventure I want to head out on someday, and something I have some friends who've done, and it sounds like an epic adventure.
Yeah, it seems like you want to get the elusive creatures, that you want to see, the ones that it's like
you can say
yeah.
I like the chase. Yeah, I like the chase for sure.
I mean, talk about that too, because you grew up in Alaska, right? So you have the Alaskan backcountry there.
I grew up in Florida.
In Florida, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Florida.
Yeah.
Okay. When did you move to Alaska then? I thought you were in Alaska. I was reading your bio, and maybe I got that wrong. That's my fault.
I have been visiting Alaska since 2018.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So kind of an interesting way for someone to grow up in Florida and end up in Alaska, right? It's like the literal polar opposite side of the country. But yeah, I grew up in Florida, as I was saying, just very immersed in nature. And Alaska is one of the two places that had a really profound impact on my development and my transition into photography specifically, beyond guiding. Alaska in 2018 is actually when I first used a camera. I was there with a good friend of mine who's a bear biologist and legendary wildlife guide. His name is Justin Gibson. And he was shooting on an Olympus camera at the time, and we were going around Alaska, covered a ton of ground, went to Denali, went to Kenai, and went to Katmai. And he sort of showed me the ropes for how to shoot, and I fell in love with the art of photography at that point. So that's how I ended up in Alaska, and I think it has just drawn me back ever since. And then the other place that's had a really profound impact, I'm sure we'll touch on, is Greenland, which was less of a wildlife experience, just more of a you could call it a spiritual wilderness experience, so to say.
I mean, when you're getting into this, I mean, let's talk about Greenland, because you talked about it, and it seems like that was such an impactful trip for you. Just tell everybody about what the reason for the trip in its, initially going there, and then what did you take out of it, and how has it impacted you since?
Yeah, so I was at the time working. I went there with a company I was working with at the time that I still do some work with from time to time, called Natural Habitat Adventures. They run trips for the World Wildlife Fund. So they have amazing trips around the world. And Greenland is a destination that they created this incredible, really remote base camp on the east side of Greenland. So I was there, and it was my first time there. Have always been fascinated and drawn to the far north, high latitudes, ironically, again, being from Florida. I think it's just something, you always want what you can't have. You chase the unknown, right? And I think Greenland and the far north is very much that for me. And going to Greenland, I was just stoked to go there. I was just excited to be there, really looking forward to immersing myself in this place, in this landscape, and the culture as well. The culture is fascinating. One of the only places in the world, I think, still today, where you can talk to a 70-some-year-old man who grew up in a sod house, who remembers in his 20s seeing power lines being laid down in his home, growing up in a time of hunting and gathering and growing old into the age of iPhones. So really, really fascinating perspective on the world and how things have changed and how climate in specific has impacted their region. So really the reason why it ended up being such an impactful experience for me was being there on the ground, staying for a week in the presence of the Greenland ice sheet, which, it's not a wild animal. And I've always sought connections to wild animals, but in this case, it was a really, really strong connection to this landscape, to this natural resource, the second largest freshwater store on the planet. And just being there and hearing the stories from the natives and from a whole variety of folks, as well as the guests we had on that trip, and seeing the guests react to it. It was just a really, really, really powerful experience where I just sort of was very grounded in the reality of the situation that we're facing as a species. And it cemented in my mind my life purpose, so to say. And I've been living by this life purpose ever since. I actually wrote myself a letter from Greenland, and I've read this on a podcast before, but I figured it's appropriate to read because it's something that it's sort of my life motto. It's what I live by. And so I wrote myself this letter at the end of the trip and sent it back to my home address here in Colorado. And I've been reading it very frequently ever since. And I wrote, "Dear Arthur from Greenland, let your soul live free, for it is not within in the pursuit of freedom through riches that you will find happiness in this world. Seek the wild, open spaces filled with wonder and inspiration, and strive to share these pure places with others, inspiring change in the most honest of ways." And so that's what I've been living my life by ever since. So Alaska and Greenland combined have had a profound impact on my life direction and what I focused my time on today.
That's incredible. When you're out, like you say, because you've been all over taking photos of wildlife and wild things, what are the things that you try to keep in mind as you're out there photographing? What's the story? Do you try to tell stories every time? Is it different with each click of the lens? What are you thinking on every sort of trip or adventure or journey that you go out to?
Yeah, it varies a lot. And I say this a lot, but I consider myself a nature lover first and a photographer second. I don't enjoy photography in the great majority. Not that I don't enjoy it, I just don't have the same passion for it in the great majority of other disciplines in photography, right? Like people photography or street photography. I started off shooting more landscapes than wildlife, or more of a balance between the two. And I've really evolved into more wildlife, but it really comes down to me to being in nature and connecting with the environment around me and grounding myself in the present moment and where I am. And, I don't really have a specific way I go about things. Some of my images are images that I sought, that I looked for, that I thought of beforehand, that I worked very hard to get, and other ones complete luck encounters, chance encounters. And both of those different kinds of images and sort of creative processes to me have just as much value as one another. I think it's important for me to have variety in how I create images. And so I don't really have a specific process. I really just go out and I let, not to sound cheesy or anything, but I really do let just like my heart and like whatever I desire guide me. Right. So if I'm in the winter, I love tracking wolves, for example. So I'll spend, days and days and days just like following wolf tracks. This winter, I followed wolf tracks all winter and I found no wolves on foot, but just following them was enough for me. Right now, had I actually found one this last winter on foot, or happened across a kill or something, that would have been an incredibly rewarding experience. And it has happened before, but at the end of the day, it's about being outside, enjoying the outdoors, and the inspiring change in the most honest of ways part of that life motto I live by, striving to share these pure places with others. That's sort of the next big piece, right? Is trying to inspire people to find their own connection in nature in a world that I deem has become ever more disconnected from nature and wilderness in particular. And I want to make the distinction between nature and wilderness because I think a lot of people don't think about that enough anymore. Yeah, just really inspiring people to find their own personal connection to nature and to do exactly what I do, which is just going out there and enjoying the outdoors and finding a connection to the world around us.
Yeah, that was what I was basically just going to ask, but I think you answered it there. How do you plan the basic logistics, the locations you're going to head to? How do you plan the areas you're going to hike into? Do you study sort of your shoot from a map, for example, before you really get after an area? Or are you genuinely just driving into your favorite spot and walking around just hoping that the shot's there?
Yeah, anything goes, right? There's times where I'll literally just look at a topo map and I'll walk around and I'll be like, this area looks sweet. I'll switch over to satellite. I mean, I'll literally use Google Maps. It's so great with all the satellite imagery and all the topo. I'll be like, this looks like a sweet spot. I'm going to hike there and check it out, And sometimes I go and I get skunked and it's not that great. And sometimes I go and, I find some fresh tracks, or if I'm lucky, an animal. I did that recently up in Juneau in Alaska. I just kind of like scouted a topo map and ended up in a beautiful little cove where I found fresh wolf tracks. And just finding those tracks, that were maybe a couple hours old was enough. And then there's other times where I'll go to spots that I know that I've been to before, where I know certain animals might frequent that area at certain times of year. And then there's a really strong community nowadays in wildlife photography. And I've made some of the closest friendships thanks to wildlife photography and, just sharing some spots. Of course, some spots are more sensitive than others, but with some friends and helping each other out has also been really, really important and instrumental to my success. I would not have made it where I am today without the help of like-minded photographers who are focused on ethically photographing animals.
Speaking of getting skunked, this is definitely something we hear from every photographer. They're out there for more than a week. They could not see a single critter, and that's a reality of being out in the woods for sure for a lot of folks who explore it. How does that affect you, if it does at all, or how do you process that type of feeling when it approaches frustration?
Yeah, I think what I try to bring myself back to again is enjoying being outside.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, I don't know, there's some sort of quote. I don't know exactly how it goes with relation to fishing, right? It's like catching a fish is not what you're not going fishing to catch. You're not catching, you're fishing.
Right, you're fishing.
You're just hoping to catch. And that's kind of how I see it. And I grew up fishing actually a lot. So I draw a lot of parallels between the two. And I think there's also a lot of parallels between wildlife photography and hunting. Of
course, yeah.
So I think it's certainly inevitably I get upset sometimes, right? Like there's times where this winter, I'm not going to lie, I was going out a lot looking for wolves, and it felt like everywhere I went, the wolves would show up somewhere else. I would leave Jackson to go look for wolves in Yellowstone, and the day I would leave, I had a friend that would spot like a pack of 12 wolves chasing elk around in the park, and then I'd come back and then the wolves would show up in Yellowstone. And so it's hard not to let frustration get to you sometimes, but I think at the end of the day, it's just being grateful that we still have all these incredibly wild places that are so worth fighting for and finding the time to enjoy. It's a privilege to be able to spend time in places like these.
Yeah, absolutely. What was the shift like for you? Like you said, you were shooting landscapes first, then you made it over to wildlife, wolves, bears, things like that. Was there a specific instance that happened, or was there just a switch that went off for you that said, I want to go a little bit more in this direction?
Yeah, so I always enjoyed photographing sort of a variety of things from landscapes to wildlife. When I got into photography in Alaska, it was very much that really, really diverse sort of portfolio, so to say. And then I think during COVID, when COVID first hit, I got laid off from the company that I went to Greenland with. There was a whole slew of layoffs, and I ended up moving spontaneously out to Jackson Hole because there was not much of a reason to be in a city. And moved out to Jackson. And at that point, you know, what had become something I would do every few weeks or every weekend turned into something that I did literally every single day, where every single morning I would go out, every single evening I would go out. I found jobs during, you know, the lull in ecotourism that allowed me to go out a lot. So I plowed snow. You know, I could work a couple days a week. It pays really well. It's a really, really exhausting, physically demanding job, but it gave me the free time I needed to spend the time I wanted to outdoors and really focus on developing my photography, my art. That's sort of when I started doing more wildlife specifically, because as incredible as Jackson is, as stunning as the landscapes are, personally, and I know there's varying perspectives on this, but personally, I feel that, you know, I've seen this landscape so many times, unless there's like a really profound, like incredible display of weather or like lightning or like some of the craziest light you've seen sometimes in the mornings or in the evenings. Animals are, you know, it's an endless resource of unique images and experiences and encounters. And so I focused more on wildlife from that point on, because I felt like I was getting more variety. I was keeping things fresh. And really ever since then, I've been doing almost exclusively wildlife, with the exception of, you know, here and there, I'll see a landscape and I'll really like it and be inspired. And I think it's important to be passionate about the things you photograph. That really comes through in your work when you are passionate. And I don't really seek out landscapes, you know, I'll seek out wildlife these days, and I might hike past a viewpoint or something, and I'm like, wow, that's epic. I have to take a photo of that, and I'll take a photo.
Right.
Yeah, Jackson's pretty incredible. You can get a lot of wildlife in your lens, I'm sure, very close to town.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, I would never really drive more than an hour out of Jackson, except when I would go to Yellowstone. An hour gave me an insane amount of photography opportunities.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I think I went on I was there recently working with a client, and we just, after dinner, we were like, let's go for a walk by the Snake River. And we instantly saw a moose as soon as I turned onto the thing.
Yeah.
There's just critters everywhere, man. It's an amazing place.
Yeah, it really is.
What do you think the most, I don't want to use the word difficult, but what do you think the most challenging photo in your memory is to have captured? Like, whether it be in the planning of it or the execution of it, what's the shot you feel you had to work the hardest to get?
Wolf shots in general.
Just all of them.
Just like, and like, it's ironic, right? Because like I could say like the shot that's been the hardest to get has been like a wolf shot, right? But my favorite wolf shot I've ever captured, I don't know if it's my best, you know, I think that's subjective, but
yeah, exactly.
My favorite wolf shot I've ever captured, which I shared with you guys, I titled it "Magnificence is the Essence of Your Being," is actually the result of a chance encounter. Despite having spent hours and hours and hours and hours, you know, looking for these animals, this is just the right place, the right time, the right animal, and the right, I think for the photographers listening, you know, a piece of advice that I always like to give is remaining opportunistic, because a lot of the best images with wildlife are just like split-second moments that if you're not fully in the moment, if you're not paying attention, it's so easy to miss these opportunities that produce some really, really incredible images. And this is one of them. This is, for those of you who have seen the image or who will go see it, it's an image of a black wolf, member of the Junction Butte pack in the northern range of Yellowstone. He's sort of a loner. I don't know if he's was, you know, sort of still a part of the pack. If he was just going around, he was kind of gnawing on an old carcass. So it doesn't sound like, or it didn't look to me like he was high up in the wolf pack by any means. And I've asked myself many times whether this wolf is still alive today, obviously for obvious reasons that I'm sure you guys have talked about a lot on this podcast. But it was up in that area of the park, and I was actually with some guests that day, some clients, and we were looking for black bears because the Junction Butte pack was out in the distance. And I was like, you know what, like we're not going to take 1,000 millimeter images of wolf dots. I take some clients out there who are really, really focused on getting intimate images of wildlife. And so we focused on looking for bears that morning and found this area that looked, that has been productive for me, and sort of pulled around a corner and saw this big black furry animal with its head down in the grass. And my instinct, since I had seen black bears there before, was, oh, black bear, like, let's go, like, let's get ready. And then it lifted its head, and it was very clearly not a black bear. I was like, well, that's a wolf. And so he was kind of 50 yards away from us, give or take, at first, maybe 70, and trotted over to this old carcass like I was talking about, was like plucking hair off of his carcass. I mean, this guy looked hungry. He was desperate for some food, and then sort of locked eyes with us and curiously walked up to us. So we got back in the car, and he sort of just like, he was just going about his day. He sort of like walked past us, just like sniffing around, and then created some more distance, walked behind us, started walking up this little hill, at which point we got back out and started taking photos again. And right before disappearing is when this image was captured. He sort of hopped up onto this big old burnt down log, and looked back at us. That image, that eye contact is maybe a second. The images before and after that one are him not looking directly at us. So he glanced at us for a split second and then hopped off the backside of that log and disappeared into the forest, just as elegantly as he, approached us and just existed around us for that short period of time. And it was just one of the most special and memorable experiences in the wild. To be graced by the presence of an animal as incredible as a wolf is a gift without a doubt. And it's incredibly rare, as you guys know, as many listeners on this show probably know, to be close to a wild wolf. And especially to be close to one in a very intimate setting where we were the only ones with this animal. So yeah, I don't know how we got on that tangent. We were talking about, the difficulty of capturing some of these images. Yep. So that, wolf shots in general, really hard. Other images that, I've worked hard for are just specific images that I've had in mind. Images of foxes, not that foxes are hard to see or photograph, but like specific perspectives on the life of a fox, or compositions have been the hardest ones, or like specific compositions of, I have a photo of a pair of moose drinking out of a creek in the Tetons, and they're perfectly lined up with the Teton behind, and having the right animals and the right light and the right landscape, like those kinds of shots I think are the hardest. In terms of specific animals I chase, and I hesitate to say that, for example, the photos, I have a few photos of bobcats and lynx, which are incredibly challenging animals to photograph. But like every truly magical, special wildlife encounter, there's a bit of luck involved at the end of the day. I think, knowledge is key, and you sort of create your own luck through your knowledge, through your persistence. Over time, the harder you work, the more opportunities present themselves. And if you're able to seize those opportunities, you can make some pretty cool pretty cool stuff happen.
While we're looking at this, well, I'm at least looking at this photo.
Yeah.
We're definitely going to put this one in the post that we put up on our Instagram when this episode is airing, so everyone can check it out. But while we're on an actual photograph, you know, it looks like you're really having, you know, a moment with this animal, and he's really looks like he's presenting himself for whatever reason. Maybe it's just to get a better look, but there's an amazing energy to this image. But let's just use this photo as an example. For the photographers in the audience, I want to just be a gearhead for a second and get into the gear and the choices you make as a photographer, especially for new photographers who want to get into this. And I've got a few of these, John. But firstly, what was the first thing you did as a photographer when your eyes caught this animal, when you became aware of it and that it might present itself for a photo? What was the first thing you did? Did you duck down? Did you just stand exactly where you were, stand perfectly still, turn on your cameras, set the settings up? What was the first thing you did?
I remember this day like it was yesterday.
Yeah, right.
I always, and this is regardless of the animal, I always like to at least, even if it's a few seconds, like 5 seconds, take note of the animal. It's easy to let yourself, and I'm guilty of it, right? When I started getting into spending more time with wildlife, I think we all get excited for wildlife encounters. But I think it's really, really important to remember that when we are in nature, when we are spending time around wildlife, we are not in our home. We are in their home, and our job as, whether it be photographers or just viewers of wildlife, is to keep animals wild and keep them undisturbed, for their behavior to remain as it would have been if we were not there. You know, that is the ultimate goal. And that sometimes is hard to do, right? But I think the first thing I do always is just like watch, like what's going on? What's this animal doing? Does he look in any way distressed? Is something else going on? Is there another animal in the area? In this case, this wolf was, like I said, head down in the grass, probably sniffing something, and lifted his head up. He was sort of just scavenging around. So I knew he wasn't, you know, he was also at a very comfortable distance when I first saw him, about 70 yards or so, and sort of a few obstacles between us and him. So I knew that, you know, I was in a good position. So at that point, I wasn't very rushed, right? I think in the event where you have a very close wildlife encounter, sort of out of the blue, that's the kind of encounter where you either have the right gear on, for the photographers listening, you either have the right gear and the right lens on, and you're ready to go, and you're in the right place at the right time, and the animal is not in any way fazed by your presence, which is very rare. But generally, these close wildlife encounters are more for personal enjoyment. In my experience, right? I think the best images have come from encounters I've had where I either tracked or saw an animal further away, and the animal trusted me enough, or at its own will approached me, or at its own will put itself in a position where it was in an ideal spot to photograph, right? So sort of letting the animals do the work and do the magic, and letting the animals do what they do, because just letting them exist is enough to create these moments of magic, like this one. So that's what I do, right? Next thing I think of is like, how far is this animal? What lens do I want to be using? And in this case, this is actually, I'm glad you brought it up for the photographers, because this image is actually created. I unfortunately only had one body on me, and I know most people shoot with one body.
Right.
Today I have two, but back then I only had one. So I would swap lenses between bodies. At first I always shoot with a longer lens at first, because I feel like you're more likely to see an animal far. So I had a 600 millimeter f4 prime lens on. So I got a lot of shots of this wolf at that focal length. And then as he headed up this hill, I didn't know that he was going to get on this log, but he was walking up towards it. And it was just it was like 6:15 in the morning, really beautiful, soft light. it was really green, like mid-June. And I saw this log and I was like, that is a damn cool log. And I really hope this wolf gets on this log.
Wow.
And so I really, really quickly, I scrambled to change my lens, and I have them all, really close to me. So I just like popped off my 600, put on an 80-300 f2.8. And that gave me the zoom that I needed to be able to actually capture this scene. Without that lens on, this shot would have never happened, and that's where I again, I'll go back to this piece of advice for the photographers listening, being opportunistic, right? Like, this is something I noticed it in the moment. I was like, that's a beautiful log. If by some miracle, this wolf hops onto this log, I want to be ready to capture that, right? Like, I had already gotten, a couple hundred photos, because we're just spraying these days, a couple hundred photos of this wolf at 600 millimeters. I was like, I'm going to switch because this could be really cool. And then the wolf did the rest, like he hopped up and he looked right at us. And, it's in those moments where these kind of things kind of evolve and manifest themselves into reality, where you almost feel like you're like telepathically connected to this animal, right?
Right.
And I know
that's what it looks like.
No, absolutely.
It's definitely like wishful thinking, but it feels that way. And I like to tell myself that we are, because it's such a special experience to be able to have, to share a gaze with a wild wolf, and especially to have it be in such an incredibly beautiful natural setting in the wild.
Mm-hmm. And you told us about the glass you were using there, but were you using the Olympus bodies that you use now then?
Yeah. So, yep, I've been shooting on Olympus, now OM system. They rebranded since I started photography, basically. Started a little bit on a Canon at first, but then quickly went over to Olympus, and now shooting OM system on the newest body they released, the OM1. And I was using, all Olympus Zuiko glass. So it's a micro four thirds sensor. So it's actually a 300 f4, but the field of view is 600. So I really enjoy using their camera equipment, because I find the image quality to be outstanding. The lenses are incredibly sharp. The colors are great. And because of the sensor being a little smaller, you're able to carry around a lot of gear and a lot of different lenses to cover a huge amount of focal ranges in, a package half the size. So it's really helpful when you're hiking a lot in the backcountry and tracking animals, which is why I've stuck with Olympus through and through, is to have that sort of flexibility and freedom to reduce my weight and capture amazing images all while doing that.
What styles of gear, types of body, maybe not exactly brands, but what types of bodies, weight, types of glass do you think are just a must in any wildlife photographer's kit that will just keep them ready to get the shots that present themselves in the wilderness? As you were talking about weight, I'm assuming portability, all of those things.
Yeah. These days, I think mirrorless cameras are a must. I mean, the technology that goes into that, they have that, the things that they're capable of, the autofocus systems, like, especially if you're in wildlife photography, I think it's a no-brainer. So definitely, and there's a ton of really, really great cameras and lenses out there from all brands. I think it all comes down to preference at the end of the day, and what's important to you. In terms of lenses, I'm a huge fan when it comes to placing animals in a landscape. I'm a huge fan of the 80-300 range. Really, really big fan of that. And then when it comes to wildlife photography in a more intimate wildlife portrait sense, I think, if you have a zoom lens, the lens that I shoot with the most is a 300-800 millimeter f4.5. And that gives me an incredibly diverse range of options. But I think that 600 millimeters, kind of the gold standard, but 400 is great. 500 is great. I'd say at least 400 if you're just getting into wildlife photography and you're like, what lens should I get? Like Sony makes a great 200-600, for example. Olympus OM system makes a great 1 to 400. That's really affordable. But if you can get the 150 to 400 at the lower aperture, that's even better. Canon makes great lenses too. But I think that like 400 is like a good minimum in terms of like telephoto distance. Any less than 400, and I feel like you're cropping a lot more than you'd want to. 4 to 600 is a really nice spot. And then what I love about the lens I shoot, the Zuiko 150 to 400, is that the field of view, like I was saying, goes up to 800. With the teleconverter that's built in, it switches it to an f/6 1000 millimeter. So for wolves, that's ideal because generally you're not that close to wolves, right? So I'm able to get much closer to my subjects and respect them with a lens like that. And I think it's important to tell yourself that what you're investing in is not just an investment for yourself and for your work, but it's also an investment into how you're going to exist around wildlife. And you're much less tempted to approach an animal if you don't need to.
Exactly.
Right? If you're shooting a 600 millimeter prime lens, you're almost forced to take a step back.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
All right, last one. So you said what you did. You described what you did at the moment of the shot, the moment it presented itself. And this could be a bit more nuanced, but what do you do before a shot presents? Being that a shot like this could come up at any time, as every photographer knows, how do you stay ready for a shot to come up in the context of your gear setup, how you carry it, how you move through the woods, even maybe your default settings, your baseline preparation for something like this to come up and for you to be ready for it?
Yep. I shoot almost always in either aperture priority or manual. They're kind of the same, right? Depending on how your camera's set up. At the end of the day, what I like to do is I like to set, and again, whatever camera you're shooting on, you can find a way to do this. But what you need to figure out how to do is to set your aperture for wildlife specifically, set your aperture as low as it goes, unless you're shooting something like a moose where there might be more of an animal you want to get in focus, right? But generally, if you're at a safe distance, keeping your aperture low. And then I basically use my ISO as my guide to achieve the shutter speed that I want. So I set my aperture, and then depending on the animal and like what the animal might be doing, if an animal's standing still a lot, you're not going to need as high of a shutter speed. So I'm just constantly thinking about shutter speed above everything else, because, if you mess that one up, or if your ISO is, this happened to me once with a close friend of mine. We were out photographing in Grand Teton. We were photographing, this is when I first moved there, photographing Grizzly 399 and her 4 cubs. And we got really lucky, and she came out right in front of our car, like out of the blue.
Wow.
We were the only ones with her for the first few minutes, which is unheard of. And I was so excited that I just started taking photos, not noticing that my ISO was on like ISO 80 or something. And I was on aperture priority mode. And when I came home, every single shot was shot at like 1/40th of a second or something. So not a single one was sharp. Ever since then, I'm like, shutter speed.
It's so true.
And I'd honestly, I'd rather overshoot my shutter speed than undershoot it.
Yeah.
These days with technology and programs like Topaz denoise, I think ISO and noise is less and less of an issue. So I just like to get the image as well as I can and then worry about the rest later.
I'm going to name that, Arthur, what it seems, at least from my perspective and listening to even though it's gear related, what you were just talking about with Steven there, is that you have this beautiful balance of being gear ready, but also nature ready, in that the things you keep saying are being in the moment and keeping things wild, and you're in their home and you don't cross the line to get the shot that you want to get. And I think that's so wonderfully stated, and it's important for people to understand that. And all of the photographers that we've had on, including yourself, have really made that a point to drive home, is that we are here in nature, in the wild, in a place that is really not ours. And that just to get these shots, to be in the moment and to understand that to be ready for something like this, it's not only gear related, but also mind and body have to be in the same spectrum in order for that to happen. And I think that's wonderful that you said that.
I'm glad you appreciate that. And that's something I focus on a lot in not just my photography, but also my guiding, just the sort of feel and mindset I create for guests on trips is always geared towards, respecting the animal, respecting the place. And I think in photography, it's ever more important. I think, these days with social media, there's a lot of other forces coming into play that might push people to like do things and not really think about what they're doing. Whereas in the past, maybe in a world sans social media, you might not have seen that as much, but I think that it's important to, as photographers and as advocates of wilderness in general, even for, again, wildlife viewing, because, photography now, I mean, we think of photographers as people with like big fancy cameras, but like in Yellowstone, there's people approaching animals far too close with their iPhones or even iPads. I've seen people take photos on their iPads out there, and it's, everybody has become a photographer, and especially with iPhones, they take great photos. People are more and more in a day where we share things digitally, and we want to have that cool, unique experience to share that with others. I think, people easily get lost in the sauce, so to say, and just, they push the limits. And I think, remaining ethical is really, really important. And we're seeing a really strong change and shift in the industry from like back in the day when, photographers around the world could capture an image of an animal and nobody would have any information on how it was captured or, what the conditions were, if the animal was baited, if it was at a game farm, like if the animal was just plain harassed in the process of getting the image, let alone baiting or anything else. Like you could just be in the presence of an animal in a way that disturbs it. And that in itself is enough to be unethical in my eyes. We're seeing this shift away from, a lot of older photographers that maybe weren't raised in that sort of mindset. And I feel like a lot of the newer up and coming photographers in the industry are really, really inspiring and have really great values that they're putting forward. So yeah, I think it's a great time to be in this field. It's a really, really exciting time to be advocating for wildlife through photography.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you on everything that you're saying. Before we move into that, because I do want to get into your wildlife guiding and also the impact that you're making for conservation. Are there any other, because I'm on your site, and again, everyone, we're going to have Arthur's website, his Instagram, so you guys can take a look at these beautiful shots that he has. Are there any other wolf experiences or wolf shots that stick out in your mind other than the one that you were talking about, magnificence is the essence of your being? Were there any others that stood out to you that you had similar experiences, or like you say, that just happened via luck, that you just showed that there was just something that happened that you were able to capture an incredible moment like the one you described?
Yeah, the first close wolf encounter I ever had, there's a series of images on my Instagram of a wolf in the snow. Really, I've only ever posted these on my Instagram. I have some wider ones, but Instagram just likes close-ups, right? So I've only ever posted these two close encounters I've had with wolves. But this first wolf encounter I ever had, that week, I had heard of this mating pair that was out in an area not too far from Jackson. And I spent, I think, that week a total of 50 hours just waiting. And this was literally just waiting, because it was a spot where they had been seen. And, wolves are creatures of habit. Obviously, there's cycles to their habits, but they, might be running a route a few times over the course of a few days or whatnot. And I spent a lot of time waiting for a total of 5 minutes with this pair of wolves. 50 hours for 5 minutes. Great exchange rate in my book after the last winter.
Yeah.
Considering I didn't even get a single minute. And it really makes you appreciate those moments even more, right? When you do get them. But this encounter, it was towards the end of the day. I was getting to the point where I was a little let down. I was like, the sun's starting to go down. It's like 4:30 p.m., like January, I don't know, it was like January 10th or something. So not a lot of light, right? Short days. And right as I'm basically ready to call it, this wolf starts howling like 200 yards away. And eventually I see it. And I had positioned myself with a friend in a place where there was a used wolf trail that they had been traveling. And I was hoping to get an image. And I do have one of my images of it sort of trotting right towards me. And so they were off in the distance, and we waited sort of at the end of this trail, and where it met up with like a groomed path under some power lines that they groom, and they groom that area to maintain them in the winter. So we had just been waiting there, and this wolf trotted straight down this wolf trail right towards us, stopped 5 yards from us, howled a few times. Its mate stayed off in the distance. She was a little more wary. She stayed about 100 yards, and he just sat there and like looked at us and looked around and looked at us and howled, and did that a few times, and then trotted off and chased her. I think you guys might have seen that. I posted that on the story yesterday.
I saw that. Yeah.
Chased her, and they were playing, and it was just absolutely one of the most incredible moments. That, and then the summer close wolf encounter I had that we just talked about are the two most notable encounters and experiences I've had with wolves in the wild. And this first one, obviously, I think I've always had this passion for wolves, right? Wolves and bears alike. Always been drawn to bears as a kid, since the name Arthur means bear. It comes from its Celtic origin, Artos, which literally means bear. So I've always just felt this connection to them. But wolves too. I literally, it's actually funny. The other day I was with my family in France, and my mom pulled up an old video of me reading just like flipping through like the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf, or one of those stories, that you read as a kid. And I was always obsessed with the wolf, even though they were portrayed as like the bad guy, always talking about the wolf and whatnot. And so to have that first experience with an animal after having, a lifetime of dreaming about having an encounter like this really was an incredibly powerful experience. And some of the words that I think I still go back to today, I wrote these words down sort of after this day. I tend to find most of my inspiration in the moment and the day of, when things are still fresh. But I wrote this down, and I think it's something that I think I've tried to spread to others, and I've incorporated into my guiding and used in my life. And it's pretty simple. We must not fear that which we do not understand. Instead, we must seek to understand why it is that we fear. And I think those words were just like, I had never read them anywhere or like anything. And they were just like repeating themselves in my head after this encounter. It was such an incredible encounter. So special to see them in the winter, in their beautiful full coats, especially, a mating pair. Some incredible opportunities came out of that. And I made some images that I'm, really, really stoked on, because they bring me back to that moment. And I think at the end of the day, like I said, being passionate about where you're shooting, to me, photography is a very personal thing, and it's a blessing to see people enjoy what I do. But I think it's important to make sure you keep the majority of that, for yourself, make sure it's something that's meaningful to you first and foremost, because why do it otherwise?
Right. Those are very important points. When you talk about your guiding, it seems like you carry the same principles that you do with photography. So what's take us through a typical experience with you as a guide? Because it seems like you want everyone to have that same spiritual, emotional connection experience. So what is it like if they're on a tour with Arthur Lefo?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. And I don't know if it's just because you caught on to it or like maybe you read something somewhere, but I definitely, like, nature to me is an opportunity for spiritual connection to the world around me. And I think incorporating that sort of opportunity for a more profound experience beyond just like, let's go see animals or whatever it is, you know what I mean? Or let's go learn about animals, which is important. But I think at the end of the day, you know, as much, and I learned this really quickly when I started guiding, it's really easy to get into a mindset as a guide where you're just like littering information on people. And at a certain point, they just shut down, right? They just want to enjoy nature. And I think focusing on, again, giving people the space to create their own connection to wilderness, I think is important. So when you're on tour, I do a lot of different kinds of tours, from photography tours to bear viewing tours, which are not photography specific. So some of my trips in, you know, the Tetons, for example, or we're driving around a lot, and maybe we'll get out and hike for a while. In Alaska, we're taking a float plane out to a remote island. It definitely varies, but I think one common thread that I really focus on throughout all my guiding is leaving space for silence, and sort of reading the room in a way, right? I think as a guide, our job is to make sure our guests are having fun, and also understanding beyond having fun is understanding the place that they are, and giving them the opportunity to create this deeper connection. And I think one of the most important ways and tools to do that is silence. So silence gives people the opportunity to think and to really like root themselves in the place that they are. And I think, for example, in bear guiding, we very frequently have clients that are really, really stoked to see a bear for their first time. And obviously they are. How couldn't you be? You know what I mean? And so they're like, bear, how many bears are we going to see? Blah, blah, blah. And like, sometimes we show up and like, we have a bear. You know, this is not all the time. I don't want to give people like false understanding of how these trips go. But sometimes, you know, you get really lucky and you show up and there's a bear, and the bear gives you a great look, a great walk by really, really early on in your 4 or 5 hour day out there before flying home. And so these people have that craving satisfied so early on. And then there's always like an awkward 30-minute period of time where they're like, so what next? But then they break through that. And I find that this happens even more fluidly. It happens even more fluidly on multi-day expeditions, right? What I'm about to say. But once they get over that initial, like, wow, like you got it out of the way. You saw your bear, right? After that is when, you know, generally there's a good opportunity to like talk about the animals and like maybe, you know, pass the torch back to the guests and be like, so what do you think was going on? What did you observe? Like, what did you think these animals were doing? Like, how did they feel? Did they look anxious? Did they look calm? Blah, blah, blah. Kind of like having them reason through what's going on, not just being the person telling them what's going on, giving them the power to sort of interpret it for themselves. And then they start like looking at things a different way, right? Because like they saw their bear, they like got that out of their system. And now they're like starting to sort of analyze and put themselves in the mind of the animal, so to say, right? Where they're trying to understand what this animal is doing. What is it doing on its day to day? Like, is this just like a passing phase? Is this a place that the animal comes back to time and time again? Is this animal interacting with other animals around it? And there's so many complexities that and lessons really that we can learn from observing animals really while remaining really present and remaining really calm and giving them the space to just exist, again, letting them do the magic for you. And it's really cool to see them sort of have that transition from like, okay, like they saw it, they were really stoked, and now it's like they're starting to have that deeper connection. There's more opportunity for silence there, right? Where like they're thinking through everything and eventually leaving, hopefully my goal as a guide is to provide people with that sort of deeper spiritual connection to the landscape, to the animals, to the environment, and a deeper understanding of why things are happening, how things got us to where we are today, and how what we're doing and what nature is doing and what these animals are doing is going to evolve into whatever will ensue. So that's kind of how I run my trips, in a nutshell, like focusing on conservation and learning also about the world around us, but in a way that's very personal to you and giving you the opportunity to sort of create your own story.
As a guide, being that the experience is so subjective, person by person, how you define personally what doing your job well looks like what happening or product at the end of a tour lets you know, yes, that says to me, I did my job well. And it sounds like it's that shift from surface to spiritual that maybe you don't see in every guest, but in at least some of them lets you know that, I did a good job on this one. This was my goal.
Yeah, I think, you nailed it. To me, what I define as success, I mean, if people have a good time, that's like, all right, I did like the bare minimum, right? Actually, no, let me back up. If they came back alive unharmed,
there you go.
That is the bare minimum. Now, if they come back and they had a good time, then like, that's great. That's great. But if they come back and they are in tears of joy, that's what I live for. There is nothing in the world that makes me happier and feel more fulfilled. And this happened on my last tour before actually leaving on this little escapade to Europe for 2 weeks. I guided 2 older sisters and one of their granddaughters. And they were very much like that, to the point that like, it's hard for me as a guide not to feel the same way when my guests feel that way. Right. Because it's a hard physical proof that like they had a really, really profound experience out there and that they get it. And when people are out there, I mean, here's sort of like a little bit more insight into how that might look from a client perspective. Seeing the animal is seeing a wild brown bear is my goal on some of these trips. I don't specify like how far or anything like that. It's just our goal is to see a wild brown bear, because that is our goal. We don't control wildlife. If we see a wild brown bear, that's incredible. But if by the end of the trip, they're not just thanking the bears, they're thanking the trees, they're thanking the birds, they're thanking the eagles, they're thanking the mountains, they're thanking the indigenous people who have been stewards to this land for tens of thousands of years. That's when I know people like really get it and have had that deeper connection to a place. And those are the experiences I think that are incredibly powerful and creating waves in conservation, right? These are the people that are going to be the most passionate advocates and the most relatable people to talk to when it comes to preserving places like these.
Yeah, I feel you, because when I do tours at Wolf Connection, it's the same. It's funny how a lot of the same things that you do, I try to incorporate in the tours that I give, is that giving that silence, trying not to overload with facts, but also what you just said rings completely true, is that if they leave knowing that they want to come back to this place. This place means more than just, I had my wolf experience. I met a wolf. I saw a wolf. I heard a wolf howl for the first time. That there's more to it than just that. Than just, the place itself has a magic. The place itself has a calming effect. The place itself brings peace or humility or whatever it may be, like you say, the conservation aspect. And I think that is so vitally important. I agree with you. I can't agree with you more on getting those types of feelings or reactions after, whether it be a tour or a guide or things of that sort.
Yeah, and like you said, it's the place, right? First and foremost. And I think this brings me, when you said that, I came back to that comment I made earlier about nature versus wilderness. And like, to me, there is a certain magic about being in a wild place versus being in a place in nature, that even if you are like, you could be in exactly the same setting, right? You could be in a beautiful forest sitting in calm and silence. But there's a difference between sitting in a forest in calm and silence an hour outside of Denver, Colorado, where there are very few carnivores, existing, top of the food chain type of animals. There's a few black bears, but like, it's nothing like, when you think about the last frontier up in Alaska, you know what I mean? Like the experience of just sitting in a forest and knowing what is around you, what exists, what roams through this forest, I think is more profound. And it's really in those places that I think some of these experiences are most possible because of the animals that inhabit them. Wolves being an incredible symbol of wildness, that they are, and that's why I think using animals like wolves and bears as sort of icons of wilderness is so powerful in conservation, because without them there is no wilderness. Truly, there is just nature. And I think wilderness is something we need to cherish and reassess in our priority list as a species.
On all points, I agree with you. Arthur, tell everybody your website, your social, where, if they want to look for you as a guide, if there's a way for that to happen, tell everybody all those things so they can look at all this wonderful stuff that you're doing and they continue to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So my main channel is on my Instagram. It's just at Arthur Lefo, ArthurLefo. That's where I post most of my stories. That's where I post my work day in and day out. New photos I'm getting. I share a ton on my stories. My website is pretty simple. It's just arthurlefo.com. I'm currently revamping my print shop, but should have some stuff available for sale by the time this episode drops. So check it out. And I'll have some tours listed on there soon as well. Starting this winter, I'll be leading my own tours so on a private basis, my own company in Yellowstone and Grand Teton, specifically focusing on wolves and the Northern Range in Yellowstone, which I guess we'll see how that works out with all the floods, and I'm not really sure how that's going to play out. That's kind of a shakeup I wasn't anticipating, but anyways, yeah. And you can always reach out to me on Instagram. That's a great way to get into contact with me, or by email, arthurlefo@gmail.com. If you have any questions about tours. Currently, we're building a lot of really, really exciting tours in Alaska next year and the years to come. Camping expeditions to go see bears, boat-based expeditions, just a lot of really, really cool stuff. And of course, doing some tours in Wyoming, as I always have, and Montana. And would love to see some of you guys out there. Another place for those of you who might be interested in my work, of course, I sell prints on my website. But we actually just opened, a few friends of mine and myself, an ethical wildlife photography gallery. It's in Nantucket, Massachusetts.
Oh, awesome.
Nice.
It's called Mother Wolf Gallery. And the image that we were talking about earlier, magnificence is the essence of your being, which was actually on the cover of the summer edition of the International Wolf Centers magazine. I don't know. for those, you guys can't see it, but if you can probably see it on my Instagram, because I'll be posting this soon.
Oh yeah, definitely post that. That's awesome.
That image is exclusively available in fine art print at Mother Wolf Gallery, and we have proceeds going back to organizations benefiting these animals, and really focusing again in this gallery on ethical wildlife photography. A lot of incredible photographers are also featured in there. Brooke Bartleson, Dave Sanford, and John Kuiper, among others. So that's about it. That's how you can get in touch with me. Would love to chat more with some of you guys in the future.
Yeah, dude, you're an incredible steward. And everybody, listen. And Arthur's right. We contacted him on Instagram, even though he was in his vacay or his trip in Europe. He got back to us. So Arthur is extremely reachable and communicative and things of that sort. My last question for you, my friend, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
It's funny because my phone actually autocorrects wild to wolf sometimes and vice versa. Like it'll just flip flop them because I guess the letters are next to one another, like the I and the O. Yeah, so wild, I think like I was saying earlier, like wolves and bears are symbols of wildness. And if you have wolves and bears on the landscape, you are truly in a wild place. And that in itself is something that I cherish very, very deeply. Mm-hmm. And I hope to inspire many, many more people to cherish very deeply. And I know many of you listening feel the same way. So thank you guys for being a part of a community of people that is essential to keeping our planet wild and beautiful.
Absolutely.
Awesome to meet you, man. This was fantastic. Yep. This is so cool. We'll have all of Arthur's stuff in the description for the podcast, and you guys definitely check him out. House to all of you out there, and Steve and I will be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the donate tab, and find out more information.